Hare Krishna, dear devotees, please accept my humble obeisances. All glory Srila Prabhupada. I hope you all are well. Thank you so much for joining His Holiness Candramauli Maharaj's daily call. We welcome you all and welcome Grace Gopika Radhika Mataji. Thank you so much again for your time and association today.
Thank you for having me here.
Hare Krishna Jai, all glory Srila Prabhupada. Thank you. So Gopika Radhika Mataji will be, giving the class today, and so nice. I've been, fortunate enough to host Mataji's classes, giving little bit service to Mataji. Thank you. So Mataji, as far as I'm aware, today Srimad Bhagavatam, first canto, 13th chapter, and 39 to 41 first. Is that correct? Yes. Should I make you the co-host?
Yes, please.
Yeah. Let me see. Yes, you can share, Mataji now. Thank you.
So today we are reading Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 1, Chapter 13, verses 39, 40, and 41. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya, Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So reading verse 39. Yudhishthira Uvacha, Naham Veda Gatim Pitror Bhagavan Kvagata Vitaha Amba Va Hata Putrartha Kvagata Cha Tapasvini. Translation. Maharaj Yudhishthira said, O godly personality, I do not know where my two uncles have gone, nor can I find my ascetic aunt who is grief-stricken by the loss of all her sons. Purport. Maharaj Yudhishthira, as a good soul and devotee of the Lord, was always conscious of the great loss of his aunt and her sufferings as an ascetic. An ascetic is never disturbed by all kinds of sufferings, and that makes him strong and determined on the path of spiritual progress. Queen Gandhari is a typical example of an ascetic because of her marvelous character in many trying situations. She was an ideal woman as mother, wife, and ascetic, and in the history of the world, such character in a woman is rarely found. Then verse 40. Karnadhara ivapare Bhagavan Paradarshakah Athaba Bhashe Bhagavan Narado Munisattamah. Translation. You're like a captain of a ship in a great ocean, and you can direct us to our destination. Thus addressed, the godly personality, Devarshi Narad, greatest of the philosopher devotees, began to speak. Purport. There are different types of philosophers, and the greatest of all of them are those who have seen the personality of Godhead and have surrendered themselves in the transcendental loving service of the Lord. Among all such pure devotees of the Lord, Devarshi Narad is the chief, and therefore he has been described herein as the greatest of all philosopher devotees. Unless one has become a sufficiently learned philosopher by hearing the Vedanta philosophy from a bona fide spiritual master, one cannot be a learned philosopher devotee. One must be very faithful, learned, and renounced. Otherwise, one cannot be a pure devotee. A pure devotee of the Lord can give us direction towards the other end of nescience. Devarshi Narad used to visit the palace of Maharaj Yudhishthira because the Pandavas were all pure devotees of the Lord, and the Devarshi was always ready to give them good counsel whenever needed. Verse 41. Narada uvacha ma kanchana shucho rajan yadishvara vasham jagat lokah sapala yasyeme vahanti balimi shitoh sa sanyunakti bhutani sa eva viyunakti cha. Translation. Sri Narad said, O pious king, do not lament for anyone, for everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, all living beings and their leaders carry on worship to be well protected. It is He only who brings them together and disperses them. Purport. Every living being, either in this material world or in the spiritual world, is under the control of the Supreme Lord, the personality of Godhead. beginning from Brahmaji, the leader of this universe, down to the insignificant ant, all are abiding by the order of the Supreme Lord. Thus, the constitutional position of the living being is subordination under the control of the Lord. The foolish living being, especially man, artificially rebels against the law of the Supreme and thus becomes chastised as an asura or lawbreaker. A living being is placed in a particular position by the order of the Supreme Lord, and he is again shifted from that place by the order of the Supreme Lord or his authorized agents. Brahma, Shiv, Indra, Chandra, Maharaj Yudhishthir, or in modern history, Napoleon, Akbar, Alexander, Gandhi, Subhash, and Nehru, all are servants of the Lord. And they are placed in and removed from their respective positions by the supreme will of the Lord. None of them is independent. Even though such men or leaders rebel so as not to recognize the supremacy of the Lord, they are put under still more rigorous laws of the material world by different miseries. Only the foolish man therefore says that there is no God. Maharaj Yudhishthir was being convinced of this naked truth because he was greatly overwhelmed by the sudden departure of his old uncles and aunt. Maharaj Dhritarashtra was placed in that position according to his past deeds. He had already suffered or enjoyed the benefits accrued to him in the past, but due to his good luck, somehow or other, he had a good younger brother, Vidur, and by his instruction, he left to achieve salvation by closing all accounts in the material world. Ordinarily, one cannot change the course of one's due happiness and distress by plan. Everyone has to accept them as they come under the subtle arrangement of Kal, or invincible time. There is no use trying to counteract them. The best thing is, therefore, that one should endeavor to achieve salvation. And this prerogative is given only to man because of his developed condition of mental activities and intelligence. Only for man are there different Vedic instructions for attainment of salvation during the human form of existence. One who misuses this opportunity of advanced intelligence is verily condemned and put into different types of miseries, either in this present life or in the future. That is the way the Supreme controls everyone. Om Ajnanatimirandhasya Jnananjanashalakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Nama Om Vishnupadaya Vishnupreshthaya Bhutale Srimate Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namine Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavade Paschatadeshatarine Vanchakalpatarubhyashcha Kripasindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. I'll just read the translations once more as a brief recap. So today we have Maharaj Yudhishthir said, "O godly personality, I do not know where my two uncles, that is Dhritarashtra and Vidur, have gone, nor can I find my ascetic aunt, that is Gandhari, who is grief-stricken by the loss of all her sons. Then you are like a captain of a ship in a great ocean, and you can direct us to our destination." Thus addressed, the godly personality, Devarshi Narad, greatest of the philosopher devotees, began to speak. So this was the first sentence was Maharaj Yudhishthir speaking to Narad Muni. And he's saying to Narad Muni that you are like a captain of a ship in a great ocean, and you can direct us to our destination. And then Narad Muni, in response, he begins to speak. And this is the first verse that he speaks. Sri Narad said, "O pious king, do not lament for anyone, for everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord. Therefore, all beings and their leaders carry on worship to be well protected. It is He only who brings them together and disperses them." I'll switch over. So basically, there is a lot in today's three verses, especially the third verse. It has a very extensive purport, and there are like so many different things that can be discussed from each of these three verses. So just for the purpose of today's discussion, I chose these 3 points. Being an ascetic, Queen Gandhari's example. Then the greatest among the devotee philosophers, Muni Sattamaha. And this sentence from Prabhupada's purport, everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord, and how this relates to fatalism versus determinism. So we'll explore these two topics in the context of this statement in Prabhupada's purport, that everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord. So going to our first point, being an ascetic, Queen Gandhari's example. So in today's purport, Prabhupada writes that an ascetic is never disturbed by all kinds of sufferings, and that makes him strong and determined on the path of spiritual progress. And Prabhupada cites Lady Gandhari, Queen Gandhari, as being a sterling example of an ascetic, how she was this ideal woman in all respects, an ideal mother, an ideal wife, an ideal ascetic, because through all the various upheavals and sufferings that she underwent all her life, like literally from her younger days as a newly married woman, all through to now her old age, and subsequently following her husband to the other world, to the next world. All through this whole journey, she had a path strewn with thorns. She had many, many upheavals, many, many sufferings, many challenges to contend with. And still she displayed this exemplary example of maintaining fortitude, maintaining resilience, maintaining her consistent adherence to her dharma through all these ups and downs in life. And so Prabhupada calls that an excellent example of an ascetic, because the quality of an ascetic, as described in today's verse, is that that person is never disturbed by all kinds of suffering. And that in turn renders the strength and determination that is required to progress in spiritual advancement. So basically, this quality of being able to stay undisturbed in the face of suffering, that is taken to symbolize strength and determination, which is required in spiritual progress. And that is why we see that in the Vedic civilization, so much importance is given to the qualities of tolerance and sense control and forgiveness, which these qualities are regarded as the symbols of strength of a person's power, which is, it's interesting because this is hardly considered the symbol of power in today's society. In today's society, what symbolizes power is, for example, money, and just how confident a person is, how assertive a person is, how much a person can dominate over others. These are regarded as the characteristics of a powerful person, of a strong person. Whereas in the Vedic concept of life, we see that the characteristics of a truly powerful person are measured in terms of how much sense control that person has, and how much tolerance that person has, and how much forgiveness that person has. It's like almost like an opposite worldview, because these things like humility and tolerance, sense control, they are almost considered weaknesses in today's society. It kind of means that you're always eating the humble pie, you keep a low profile. That's how it is misunderstood in today's society. Whereas if you're a dominant, assertive person, that is strength. But here we see that the actual strength is like, if a person has this ability to not get disturbed by suffering, how much more power does that give a person as compared to one who loses sense control at the least provocation? A person may have all the money in the world, all the influence in the world, but if at the slightest provocation, that person loses sense control, loses the ability to judge things properly, loses the ability to think clearly, loses the ability to control his anger and behave in a sober and empathic way, then how much weaker such a person is compared to someone who is able to maintain equilibrium, who is able to maintain clarity of thought, who is able to maintain that sense of control and command over his own emotions. That is the Vedic worldview, according to which power and strength is measured. And that is why we see this example that when there is this debate among all the rishis at the bank of Saraswati regarding which deity is most powerful, is it Brahma or Vishnu or Lord Shiva? And then Bhrigu Muni, he gets assigned this task of conducting a real life experiment to find out for sure who among these three deities is the most powerful, the greatest of all. And so the measure that he uses to test their greatness is he tests their tolerance. And so we have this famous story where Bhrigu Muni, he first goes to Lord Brahma, and he's Lord Brahma's own son, and he approaches his father, but he does not offer any respect to Lord Brahma. So basically that means that he committed an offense, a mental offense, an offense through his mind, that he approaches his father, his senior, but he's not giving any respect. And Lord Brahma, he takes note of that. He takes note of that and he becomes very angry. But he manages to suppress and subdue that anger through his higher intelligence. And Bhrigu Muni, he leaves that place, he leaves Brahmaloka, and then he goes to Lord Shiva. And there he commits a slightly graver offense, the next step in the hierarchy of offenses, which is offense by words. So to Lord Brahma, it was an offense by mind, and here it was an offense by words. Lord Shiva, because he's Bhrigu Muni's brother, he gets up to welcome Bhrigu Muni very joyfully. And Bhrigu Muni, he says, "Oh, get away from me. You are a deviant heretic." And so he uses abusive language to Lord Shiva. And Lord Shiva immediately becomes extremely angry and he takes up his trident and he's just about to kill Bhrigu Muni. But then his consort, Parvati Devi, she falls at Lord Shiva's lotus feet and begs him to stop. And in this way, Lord Shiva is somehow able to get pacified and control his anger. And from there, Bhrigu Muni makes his way to Vaikuntha Loka. And over there, he commits the ultimate that can be done in terms of an offense, which is Lord Vishnu is lying in Vaikuntha Loka. He has the scene where he's lying with his head on the lap of his consort, the goddess of fortune, Lakshmi Devi. And Bhrigu Muni, he enters that place and straight away, without saying anything, no words are used, nothing, just straight away goes there and kicks Lord Vishnu squarely on the chest. And here we see the distinction between Lord Vishnu's reaction and the other personality's reaction, in that Lord Vishnu, instead of far from getting angry, he immediately gets up and welcomes Bhrigu Muni with sweet and gentle words. And he says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, my dear greatest of all sages. I'm so sorry that we failed to notice your arrival. How are you? What can we do for you? And I hope your foot was not hurt by my chest, which is as hard as a thunderbolt." And he takes up Bhrigu Muni's feet and starts to massage them. And needless to say, I mean, yeah, the conclusion of the test was that yes, Lord Vishnu indeed is the greatest, because he possesses the qualities of pure goodness, because no one else demonstrated the level of tolerance and equanimity and equilibrium that was displayed by Lord Vishnu. So yeah, in the Vedic concept, these qualities of an ascetic, they are considered the true mark of greatness of a personality. And the same thing yes, for example, we see this in Prahlad Maharaj's conversation with his father Hiranyakashipu, where he says the same thing, that in former times, Prahlad Maharaj is saying, there were many fools like you who did not conquer the 6 enemies that steal away the wealth of the body. So here by 6 enemies, he means to say the 5 senses and the mind. So Prahlad Maharaj is saying that there were many fools who did not conquer these 6 enemies. And these fools were very proud, thinking, I have conquered all enemies in all the 10 directions. So basically, yes, that is a reference first and foremost to Hiranyakashipu himself. He did all this amazing tapasya, got all these amazing benedictions, and he's thinking that he's conquered all enemies in all 10 directions. But Prahlad Maharaj points out that unless one has control over one's own enemies, one's own self, this five senses and the mind, then one is trapped anyway. One has not conquered any enemies. But Prahlad Maharaj continues, if a person is victorious over the six enemies and is equipoised toward all living beings, for him there are no enemies. Enemies are merely imagined by one in ignorance. So this, is again the Vedic concept of who is a true conqueror, the one who is a Goswami, the one who is the Lord of the senses, so who is able to dominate the senses rather than the senses dominating the person. That person is the real conqueror. That person is the really strong and powerful person. And similarly, and just as Lord Vishnu, he was noted to be the most tolerant of all the great personalities in the entire existence. Similarly, Lord Vishnu's devotees, by that same strength, are able to be the most tolerant in all of creation. And that is why we have this famous verse by Lord Shiva, Narayana parasarve na kutasthana bibhyati swarga pavarga narakesh vapitulyartha darshana. Devotees solely engaged in the devotional service of the Supreme Personality of Godhead Narayan never fear any condition of life. So the same thing that Prabhupada is writing here. An ascetic is never disturbed by all kinds of sufferings. So the same thing Lord Shiva is saying here, the devotees, they never fear any condition of life. For them, the heavenly planets, liberation, and the hellish planets are all the same. For such devotees are interested only in the service of the Lord. And the context in which this word was spoken was that King Chitraketu, he was wandering around in his airplane and he spots Lord Shiva sitting with his wife Parvati Devi. And he says something which gets misinterpreted. He merely expresses wonder at Lord Shiva being seated like that with his wife. He was not being offensive. He just expressed his wonder at that scene. And Lord Shiva understood that, but Parvati Devi, she misunderstands it to be offensive behavior. And she curses King Chitraketu to be a demon, which is how he gets born as Vritrasur later on. And even though King Chitraketu, he has the full power to nullify that curse, to counteract that curse, he very respectfully bows down and accepts the curse. And Parvati Devi is very surprised at that, taken aback at the level of tolerance and equanimity that he displayed in that crucial moment. And that is when Lord Shiva utters this famous verse, that yes, this is the potency of the devotees of the Lord, that they are people who are completely fearless, completely equanimous in all conditions of life, whether it's heavenly planets, liberation, or hellish planets. So these were a few reflections regarding being an ascetic and the power of that quality. Then moving on to Muni Sattama, the greatest among the devotee philosophers. So in one sense, this is an interesting phrase that Prabhupada chooses to use here, that devotee philosopher. So we have two things here. The person is a devotee as well as a philosopher. In today's world, these two things are usually considered to be opposite to each other. Religion is considered to be something, if a person is a bhakta, is a devotee, that means that person does not really have much intellectual understanding. The person is just, a person of the heart, a person of sentiments and emotions. Whereas a philosopher, that person is usually regarded as being someone who cannot be a devotee, because that person is a thinker, he's an intellectual. So here Prabhupada combines these two words, saying devotee philosophers. And the Sanskrit that is used in today's verse is Muni Sattama. So Sattama basically means someone who is the greatest. And so the greatest among all the Munis. So this reminds us of this famous sentence by Prabhupada in his Bhagavad Gita purport, which Prabhupada used to say often in his lectures also, that religion without philosophy is sentiment or sometimes fanaticism, while philosophy without religion is mental speculation. So here Prabhupada is giving this really wonderful explanation of what it means to be a true devotee. A true devotee is not one who is just merely religious without philosophy, because that results in sentimentality or fanaticism. And neither is a true devotee one who is just a philosopher, just a dry thinker without any bhakti, because that is just mental speculation. So a devotee has both the things. That person is a devotee, a bhakta, as well as a philosopher. And so the Muni Satamaha part over here, if you look at the word Muni, the Prabhupada gives the definition of Muni in Bhagavad Gita 256 purport, saying that the word Muni means one who can agitate his mind in various ways for mental speculation without coming to a factual conclusion. It is said that every Muni has a different angle of vision. And unless a Muni differs from other Munis, he cannot be called a Muni in the strict sense of the term. So this is basically what a Muni is. A Muni is a thinker, a mental speculator, someone who, digs and gets to the root of things, questions, peels the layers of meaning of everything. And every Muni has to have a different perspective, a different point of view. Only then that person will be regarded seriously by other Munis. Otherwise, what are you doing? You're just following other people. No, you have to have some original viewpoint. That is a real Muni. But here we see that Narad Muni is called Muni Satama, the greatest of all Munis. So what makes him that? So if we look here, when we talk about Munis and their perception of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, we find this in the Brahma Samhita, where Lord Brahma says, Panthastu koti shatavatsara sampragamyo, vayo rathapi manaso muni pungavana, sopyasti yat prapadasimnya vichintya tattve, govindamadi purusham tamaham bhaja. So this verse is also talking about Muni Pungavana, so one who is the best among the Munis. So even those who are very expert Munis, that is, who are very expert mental speculators, very intelligent thinkers, they may try to understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead for many billions of years through their mental speculative processes, traveling at the speed of the mind or the wind. But still, the absolute truth will remain inconceivable to them, because a materialistic person cannot measure the length and breadth of the Supreme Personality of Godhead's unlimited existence. So this Prabhupada and Lord Brahma are pointing out that this is bound to fail. This attempt is bound to fail because the Supreme Lord by default is unlimited and we are by default limited. So no matter what our intellect is, no matter at what speed we go, a finite conditioned soul can never reach the infinite super soul by one's own endeavors alone. That's just a mathematical fact. We are finite, the Supreme Lord is infinite. By our own finite endeavors, it's not going to be possible to bridge that distance, to bridge that gap. So then how do we reconcile? How that is given again by Lord Brahma in this very famous verse in his prayers to Lord Krishna in Canto 10, chapter 14, where he says, Gyane prayasa mudapasi namanta eva jivanti sanmukharitam bhavadiya vartam. Dhane sthita shruti-gatam tanuvan manobhirye prayasho jita jitopyasita trilokya. So here we are getting to this point of philosophy come religion, both. So Lord Brahma is saying, O my Lord Krishna, a devotee who abandons the path of empiric philosophical speculation, aimed at merging in the existence of the Supreme, and engages himself in hearing your glories and activities from a bona fide sadhu or saint, and who lives an honest life in the occupational engagement of the social life, can conquer your sympathy and mercy, even though you are ajita or unconquerable. So this is the formula that Lord Brahma himself is giving over here. In the Brahma Samhita, he said it is not possible by philosophical speculation to reach the Supreme. Then how is the Supreme to be reached? He's saying by giving up that path of philosophical speculation. But then does it mean we just become emotional, sentimental fanatics? No. He says engaging himself in hearing your glories and activities from a bona fide sadhu. So the path of philosophy remains the path of reasoning, logical philosophy. That thing we don't leave. A person still engages himself in hearing about Lord Krishna's glories and activities, but from a bona fide source, a realized source who has direct first-hand knowledge of the Lord through the parampara system. So when one engages in that kind of hearing, when one engages in that form of acquiring knowledge, and who at the same time lives an honest life in the occupational engagement in one's occupational engagements. It says here, sthane sthitah shrutikataam tanuvan manobhir. Whatever one's situation is in life, one executes one's duties honestly, then that person can conquer even the unconquerable Lord. So that is how that bridge gets, that distance gets bridged. We are finite, God is infinite, and He is unconquerable. But through this activity, by submissively hearing about Krishna's glories from a bona fide sadhu, one is able to conquer that person who is actually unconquerable, who is ajita. That person becomes jita or conquered. And that is why Lord Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, a very famous verse we've all heard numerous times, Bahunam Janmanamante Gyanvan Mam Prapadete Vasudeva Sarvamiti Sa Mahatma Sudarlabha. That there are many, many Gyanis, but who is the greatest Gyani of all of them? It is the person who is a Bhakta. After many births and deaths, he who is actually in knowledge surrenders unto me, knowing me to be the cause of all causes. And all that is such a great soul is very rare. This is the culmination of Gyan. The greatest Gyani is the one who has understood and realized sufficiently to come to this conclusion that the aim of life is to surrender to the Supreme. And that, of course, again, as we saw in the earlier verse, hearing about Krishna's glories from a bona fide sadhu. So the path of philosophy, we don't leave. It's not that it's all about emotions, sentiments, no. We still stick to hearing Krishna's glories, understanding that philosophy, gaining a very, very sound understanding of the Bhagavad philosophy and the Bhagavad conclusions. So we have this really powerful verse in Chaitanya Charitamrita Adi Leela, where it says, Siddhanta Baliya Chitta Nakara Alasa, Eha Haite Krishna Lage Sudhrada Manav. Which means basically that one should not shy away from discussions of philosophy, from discussions of Krishna conscious philosophy. One should not be lazy, it says here. Nakaraha alasa. Alasa means laziness. So one should not be lazy about engaging in such philosophical discussions, because through these discussions, lage sudridha manasa, one's faith and one's conviction in Krishna consciousness, that becomes sudridha, or it becomes strong. So in the purport to that verse, Prabhupada writes, there are many students who, in spite of reading the Bhagavad Gita, misunderstand Krishna because of imperfect knowledge and conclude him to be an ordinary historical personality. This one must not do. One should be particularly careful to understand the truth about Krishna. If because of laziness one does not come to know Krishna conclusively, one will be misguided about the cult of devotion, like those who declare themselves advanced devotees and imitate the transcendental symptoms sometimes observed in liberated souls. So therefore we get this perfect balance in this term, devotee philosopher. And in this sentence by Prabhupada, religion without philosophy is sentiment. This is what Prabhupada is saying in that purport we just read. That, yeah, if you don't have philosophy, then you'll just become sentimental. You'll get misguided. You'll get fooled by other people who take advantage of our ignorance and pose themselves to be God or godly and exploit us. All those dangers remain for someone who does not have a strong backing in philosophy. Or it may lead to fanaticism, just being fanatic because there is no reasoning involved. And philosophy without religion is equally dangerous because it is mental speculation and it will never lead to the ultimate goal. And therefore, the devotee is Muni Sattama, the greatest, the devotee philosopher. And Narad Muni is Muni Sattama, basically, the greatest among all the devotee philosophers. Yes, all Vaishnavas are devotee philosophers, and Narad Muni is described here as the greatest among the devotee philosophers. And moving on to our very final point in today's discussion is Prabhupada's statement, everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord, distinguishing between fatalism and determinism. So basically, fatalism means what we see in today's society, that people think that if you think that everything is under the control of the Supreme Lord, that means you are being fatalistic, which means that you're just hopeless. You just think everything is anyway in the hands of God. Nothing is in my control. Nothing that I do can make any difference. So I'll just sit passively and just wait for whatever is going to happen, because whatever has to happen will happen anyway. That is regarded as fatalism. And in today's society, basically, people usually think that if one believes in God, if one believes that God is the supreme controller, that means one is by default a fatalist person. And then this other thing, the opposite of fatalism, is determinism, which means that a person recognizes that, no, I do have some control over my destiny. And what I do does make a difference in charting the future course of events in my life. So yeah, it's important to distinguish between these two in the context of this statement, because yes, the Bhagavatam says, Srila Prabhupada says, everything and everyone is under the control of the Supreme Lord. Does that mean we are being fatalistic? It turns out, no, it does not mean fatalism. Because in the Bhagavad Gita, we can see in this verse, chapter 18, verse 14, Lord Krishna says, Adhishthanam tatha karta karnam cha prithak vidham vividhashcha prithak cheshta daivam chaivatra pancham. So Krishna is basically describing the 5 factors of action here, which he says are the place of action, which is the body, the performer. For example, if I'm doing something, so my body is one factor of action, then I myself, the performer, I'm the second factor of action. The various senses that I possess, that is the third factor. The many different kinds of endeavor, the many different kinds of activities that I perform, that is the fourth factor. And ultimately, the super soul, that is the fifth factor, Daivam Shaivatra Panchamam. So the super soul is one of the 5 factors of action. So when one does not take into account this particular factor, then one's equation does not get completed. So it's actually an entirely scientific thing to recognize the ultimate or the fifth factor of action, which is Daiva. Just thinking that ourselves, our actions, our endeavors, the power of our senses, our sincerity, our dedication, our hard work, all these things are going to result in the outcome is an incomplete equation, because there is another thing which is needed to complete that equation, and that is the sanction of the Supreme Lord. But then, does it mean, again, coming back to the fatalism question, does it mean then I should just become hopeless and passive because he's going to control everything? What do I have to do anyway? So the Vedic scriptures tell us no, because we see here, right there in the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says to Arjuna, Arjuna is actually trying to follow that philosophy. He wants to abandon the battlefield. He wants to go to the forest and just meditate. And Krishna says, Tasmat Mamuttishta Yasho Labhasva Jitva Shatrun Bhungshva Rajim Samriddham Maye Veite Nihtaha Purvameva Nimitta Matram Bhavasavesakya. Therefore, get up, prepare to fight and win glory. Conquer your enemies and enjoy a flourishing kingdom. They are already put to death by my arrangement, and you, O Savyasachi, can be but an instrument in the fight. So this demonstrates the perfect balance between recognizing the supreme control of Krishna and at the same time our role as his instrument. Yes, Krishna is the controller. We can do nothing by ourselves. We can achieve nothing by ourselves. But this need not be a disempowering thing. It is actually the supremely empowering thing, because we recognize that we get to be Krishna's instrument. We get to be one of the things that completes that overall bigger picture, that overall bigger plan of the Supreme Lord. So people usually think that when we say God is in control, that means it's a very disempowering thing. We are losing control. But actually, we are gaining control, because firstly, we are situated in reality. And secondly, now, instead of just being one tiny person who is battling against the massive forces of material energy, instead of being that, we are now connected with the supreme power, and we are acting as instruments of that supreme power. So actually, this feeling is supremely empowering. This philosophy is supremely empowering rather than disempowering. And that is why we see Srila Prabhupada, founder Acharya, at the age of 70, when he is embarking on this impossible mission of going all by himself to the West with no money, no resources, no contacts, just nothing at all, something which was completely unprecedented, which had never been done before in history. And this is the poem. This is part of the poem that he wrote on the ship on his way to America. Ani acho jadi Prabhu amara nachate, nachao nachao Prabhu nachao se mate. Kashtera putale jata nachao se mate. Oh Lord, I'm just like a puppet in your hands. If you have brought me here to dance, then make me dance. Make me dance, oh Lord. Make me dance as you like. Markene Bhagavatam. So this is the kind of courage which a devotee has through his or her dependence on Krishna. When a devotee recognizes that Krishna is in control, that is not a source of feeling hopeless and passive. That is actually the source of great strength and courage and dynamism, as reflected here in Prabhupada's prayers to Lord Krishna. He recognizes, okay, I'm nothing, but I'm a puppet in your hands, Krishna. So I'll just follow your plan. If you want me to dance, I'll dance. I'll just dance according to your plan. And that is the supreme source of courage in a person. And even at a very practical level, we see that bhakti, it nullifies all our sinful reactions that are in store. This famous verse of Pradabdam Phalam Papam Kutam Bijam Phalam Mukham Raminaiva Pradiyeta Vishnu Bhakti Ratata. So a devotee recognizes just by his practice of devotional service, the person is anyway charting one's destiny. The person is changing one's destiny because all the dormant reactions to sinful activities are being destroyed. And the person is now acting as a pure instrument in Krishna's hands. So yeah, following in the footsteps of our founder Acharya, we recognize this thing, that the greatest source of empowerment is to be an instrument of Krishna. I'll end here. Thank you. Thank you much.
Sorry, I couldn't unmute. Thank you once again. A wonderful, brilliant class, Mataji. I really like your slides and so nicely explained, even much, much more than what was, about what I could actually thought of from the puppets and from the verses. Thank you for elaborating it so nicely. Hare Krishna. Devotees, if you have any question, comments, please, or realization, please unmute and ask questions, or you can type it in the chat. I can read it for you. And it would be nice to have your cameras on. Yes, Raj Prabhu, first. Please go ahead.
Hare Krishna. Please accept my humble obeisances. All glories to Srila Prabhupada. All glories to Guru Maharaj. Thank you for that nice class, Mataji. You were talking about Queen Gandhari, and you were talking about her tolerance and her humility. And we hear about these two words a lot. What is the best way for us to develop our tolerance and humility?
I guess I'm not a very qualified person to answer that, because I'm like, yeah, I don't know if I have even an iota of these two qualities in myself. But I guess from reading about all these great personalities, one thing I think we could say is that first is to recognize the ideal, then recognize where we are at, realistically speaking. Well, sometimes it just happens that we read about all these extreme examples, extremely elevated personalities, and they're super elevated examples. And then it just kind of becomes either very hypothetical or just very, or we start to, just feel hopeless if we can never, ever come to that standard. So the first thing is to just realize that, okay, these are the examples that exist in Shastras. That means such a thing is possible. This is the, the prototype. This is the ideal that we are all aspiring for. And then just have a very realistic assessment of what our level is, and then try to make whatever progress one can from the level one is at, without like artificially trying to be something we are not prematurely. That kind of makes for a more sustainable way to progress. When we are, okay, I recognize that I hardly have any humility, I hardly have any tolerance, but this is where I'm at. Okay, so I can start one baby step at a time. And maybe one good way to do is, one practical way to do it is that we can just try to see that, because like the material world is very expert at supplying all kinds of situations that test our humility and tolerance. Like we don't need to go looking for that. We get plenty of those practice sessions. So what we can do at a practical level is just try to ensure that whenever these situations arise, I can try as much as possible not to deviate from the right path. That in spite of whatever is happening, I just try to do what is right to whatever limited capacity I can. So maybe that is one thing that we can try to do at a practical level. And the more we do it, then the more kind of the strength builds from that. And yeah, we may be able to face greater tests eventually.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mataji. That sounds nice. Just by focusing on it, thinking about it will help us. Thinking about what we can do in the situation. Thank you, Mataji.
Thank you. Thanks, Raj Prabhu. Anyone else? I would like to comment one thing on Raj Prabhu's question is that a few months back, on suggestion from my parents and my sister, I started a yoga classes. And it's so funny that when the yoga teacher was teaching us the asanas, she used to always take us, body to be a stretched level. And she would say that you have to keep your breathing level and the face expression as it is, a normal. And I used to think that, sometimes life squeezes us out and stretches, but we have to keep our breathing level, our face expression, and as it is. So that I think taught me how to be tolerant when situations goes opposite. And it was just a small exercise of keeping just your face expression. You always smiling, you're calm. It's just a fake expression, but maybe I think it will lead to one day to a normal. It will come to the practice. So it was just my humble experience.
Thank you for sharing that, Mataji.
Actually, Devi Mataji, please go ahead. Sorry to keep you waiting.
No problem. Thank you, Satyabhama. Thank you, Gopika Radhika, for such a scholarly and brilliant presentation once again. I was thinking about the Muni Satama. Muni, by definition, is one who keeps mentally speculating and doesn't arrive at any conclusion. In fact, one is not called a Muni unless he comes up with his own original speculation and so on. But yet, we sometimes refer Mahamuni Vedavyas. We refer to Veda. So how is it that such great people can also be called Muni when we know Muni is a mental speculator?
Right. Right. I guess you're right there. Absolutely, Mataji. I guess one thing is probably that sometimes some of these Sanskrit terms get used interchangeably a lot, like we see in the case of the word Bhagavan or the word Ishwara. So Bhagavan, technically, we have one definition, which means someone who possesses all six opulences, which means it can only refer to Krishna. But then we also see Bhagavan being referred to Narad Muni, to Lord Shiva, to different other personalities who are not the six Shadaishwarya Purna Bhagavan. So in that way, perhaps we could say that, yes, in one sense, Vedvyas, he is a Mahamuni in the sense that he's capable, he is a thinker, he's capable of that level of intellectual acuity and exertion. But at the same time, it is not a dry, speculative kind. It is of a kind which is following in parampara from the Supreme Lord himself. So perhaps that is, and like even in today's verse, right? Because Narad Muni is being referred to as the greatest of all Munis. But here, what it means is not that he is the most speculative of all speculative people, but just that he is as intellectually capable as all these other Munis, but it is a different kind. It's a different level altogether. It's the ultimate, like, I guess, even like the word yogi, it just comes to mind. Krishna says, yoginam api sarvesham madgatena antaratmana. So yogi is one who does all those 9 practices of yoga, right up to dharana, dhyan, samadhi. That is there. Yam, niyam, asan, pranayam, pratyahar, all that. But then we have a devotee who is the highest of all yogis. Even though that person may not be doing that pranayam, pratyahar, all that, but we call the devotee as the highest yogi. So similarly, the devotee is the highest philosopher, the highest muni, basically the highest everything. So maybe from that point of view, they say Mahamuni Vyasdev.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you, Mataji.
Thank you. Thanks, Mataji, for your question. Anyone else? I guess there are no other questions. So maybe we can close the session now. Thank you so much, Mataji. Thanks for your time and association. Thanks.
Thank
Hare
you.
Krishna.
Thank you so much.
Shila Prabhupada ki jai.
Jai.